Hey, what's up? And welcome to episode 17 of the Emotional Bankroll podcast, a series where I interview DFS pros about the mental health and lifestyle of playing DFS for a living. You may have the financial means to go pro, but do you have the emotional bankroll to deal with the highs and lows? Welcome, I'm Brian Jester, and in today's episode, I chat with Daniel Hutchings, who you likely know as nerdytenor on DraftKings and Purple Octopus on FanDuel. Known for his simulations and his prowess in PGA DFS and NFL Showdown, Daniel is currently the 27th ranked player in the Roto Grinders rankings. I talked with Daniel about the beneficial partnership that kickstarted his whole DFS career, how to balance curiosity versus anxiety when evaluating your play and results, what it feels like to be running under expectations for the year, his singing career, and what we'd have to do if we needed to get back into the workforce after playing DFS for a living. Now, the first season of this series is coming to a close as I'm taking some vacations in August and the NFL grind is right around the corner. But still, make sure you are subscribed, whether it's here on YouTube or in your favorite podcast app, to catch the last episode or two, which includes my appearance as a guest on this show. So stay tuned. And now on to the interview. All right, let's bring him in and let's talk to Daniel. Daniel, what's up, man? Thanks for joining me. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and you were somebody that I wanted to get on the show earlier, but you were so popular with everyone else's podcast, I figured I'd give you a break and let you rest a little bit and then bring you on to our show.
It's all right. I like to talk, I guess, so it's all good.
Perfect then. So let's just jump right into it. And because you've done so many other shows, you've done a lot of discussion on your process, some discussion on your background, and if those of you listening are interested in that, you can go listen to Daniel's other appearances on other podcasts. But I do want to start, as I do with every guest, and starting with your background and how you got into DFS, because you have an interesting story with a partnership. So for those who aren't aware, maybe tell us a little bit about how you got into DFS and what this partnership consisted of.
Well, I came into DFS because I've done a lot of work in the poker world, and I had someone I had worked with on a very successful poker project, and he had the idea to explore DFS. I met with him and a couple other strong tech people to discuss that as a possible avenue of research and maybe trying to attack the game of DFS. I elected not to join them in that because I was too busy with other things. But that sort of planted the seed in the back of my mind. Fast forward a couple years later, I had been playing on and off with NFL Showdown software, just trying to create an automated analytic-based system to play showdown contests. And I got to a point where I could tell in my testing that it was very strong, strong enough to have a significant edge, but I also wasn't willing to risk a lot of money on it at that time. So I contacted somebody I knew who trusted me that also had money to invest and made a proposition that he put up the money basically. And if we won, I would get a portion of the winnings. But if we lost, he would lose whatever we lost. So it was a free roll situation for me. So the first year in 2019, we basically broke even. And then in 2020, we had a huge hit. We had a two-person tie on a Monday Night Millionaire. So then I paid off his portion, and then I took that to start my own bankroll. That's sort of how I got started.
So initially they brought this idea to you, and then it took a couple of years for you to start building your own NFL Showdown software. Was it really just the timing was right for you now to start playing with it? What changed from that first interaction until that point where you started building some software yourself?
Well, I think the first time I met with them, they had some very ambitious ideas of what to do, and it was a little bit more than I could do at the time. But when I was doing it on myself, it was just sort of on and off as almost like more of a hobby. I'd poke away at it, and I just got far enough where I was like, "Hey, this is actually pretty good." And the rest is history, I guess. After I had that huge success with NFL Showdown, I added golf and then basketball and baseball and MMA. Still haven't quite cracked that nut. Maybe you could give me some pointers later.
You got enough edges. I think I'll let you try to figure that out on your own. But
Fair enough.
so the partnership is interesting, right? And I'm aware of similar partnerships within the industry that other players have that are along those lines. And I think it makes a ton of sense for someone who definitely has the technical skills and for someone who's just starting out and can find those types of partnerships. And it seems like a win-win situation for everyone because you're not risking anything. You still get a portion of the winnings. But I guess either looking back at it or during the time, did you feel that there are any negatives to that arrangement?
I mean, in retrospect, if I knew I was going to hit the huge payout, right, I wouldn't have gotten his help. But I don't really regret that at all because I never would have, if not for the partnership, I never would have made the attempt. Because I have a family and I ran a whole bunch of bankroll simulations for different outcomes under certain assumptions. And, just looking at the main showdown, the island showdowns, the big GPPs, like losing 50,000 in a season is totally within the realm of possibility. And it was not something I was willing to risk at the time, taking that kind of financial hit. So it just worked out for both of us. So very satisfying.
Yeah, I would say so. And yeah, that's well within the range of possibilities. Even someone with the biggest edges can have that kind of season just based on the inherent variance in the sport. So I'm curious to know, and this question, I'm approaching it from two angles. So you can answer this question from both ways. The first angle is when you first started building that initial showdown model. And the second angle is when you started adding on golf and NBA and MMA and these other sports. What is the point, or what was the point where it clicked and you realized, okay, I think I have something here?
The first two sports, which were NFL and golf, I approached very cautiously. I did a lot of testing before I really put volume in. So by the time I was ready to invest real money in those two sports, I was reasonably confident that they were strong. But I think after golf was the real switch for me. I had sort of a high level view of how pretty much all DFS contests could work in a systematic way, like how I could integrate all of the pieces. And so after golf, I was super aggressive with baseball. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to go ham at baseball, having never done it before, which went extremely well last year. Less well this year. One of the reasons I'm talking to you now.
Yes, because the stories we hear, there's some survivorship bias, right? Where people find the answer,
Absolutely.
they go for it, and they hit big and they continue. But there's so many other people that think they have the edge, and they probably even do have the edge, but because the variance, their bankroll doesn't last. So for you to hit that in baseball first is fantastic, right? Obviously that helps a lot of things. And again, as I described at the top, you've talked about your process on other shows. And the one part that is so interesting to me is your evaluation process, because I think many people overlook that aspect, especially if they're winners, because why change, why look into the results when they're winning results? When you and I both know that's a very important part, and obviously you know this. So at a high level, just can you kind of recap what your evaluation process looks like for your entries and your results?
Yeah, sure. So it takes a tiny bit of background. The way my process works, I typically, let's say we're playing a 15-game baseball slate, the big GPP, 30,000 entries and $50,000 the first. My process actually might generate tens of thousands of lineups that it likes. Okay, and I can only play 150, right? So there's some randomization in which 150 are selected, but that's just even more variance, right? So after the contest is over, I look at all of the lineups my process could have selected and not just the ones I actually selected. And then I compute what the average return was for all of those. If I had played those against everyone else and, the games went the way that they did. This is in contrast to like a more biased simulation, which I also started doing for other reasons, where you basically look at all the entries in the contest and then use your own sims to figure out how much money you're winning on average. The problem with that approach is it smuggles in any bias you have in your simulation methodology. So your own lineups are going to look great under that methodology because you're going to score your own the best. That's why you selected them. But this other way, which is simulating what my process would have done many, many times rather than what the athletes would have done, it removes a lot of the noise, a lot of the variance. So it makes it easier for me to more quickly identify what my ROI, my expected ROI actually is. But there's still quite a bit of variance in there because even if I do this, there's just tremendous variance in what athletes' performance was on each slate and what all the other players did, right? Like if there's a day where I think the Dodgers should be stacked 10% of the time and the field does it 30% of the time and they smash, then my sims are going to look really bad. I'm not winning that day. And you can't ever get rid of that kind of variance.
And right, it's impossible. But it is interesting that you do both sides of it, right? Because clearly you see the value in the Sims-based approach, despite its bias, right? Is that the reason why you started doing those as well, just to hit it from a different angle? Because your process-based approach is nice, obviously, but there's still the fact of there's variance in the athlete performance, like you said. So I'm just curious why you decided to look at both angles.
Well, I actually came on it doing research for somebody else who asked me a question about something I found interesting, and I wrote up this tool. It actually took very little time to write because I had most of the pieces already, and I'm like, I should start running this on my own contest and just see what it spits out. I think honestly that what it's provided the most is just seeing which players pop up near the top of the list and how that changes from contest to contest. I find very interesting.
Which DFS players?
Yeah, which competitive DFS players and which contests. And I also try to compare, I've started comparing the difference between my bias simulations and my process simulations. And ideally, in the long run, I want those numbers to be as close together as possible, right? Because if my bias sims are just like 3 times better than my process sims, it tells me which I have been that off in some sports where I'm just starting out. I think my first shot at NASCAR was fairly terrible, and I looked at, once I had this tool, I went back and I'm like, yeah, these numbers do not look very good.
Especially in a sport like NASCAR, where there isn't a ton of publicly available data, and I wouldn't say it's solved by any means. Do you think there's value in looking at those simulations and they're being extremely biased in your favor, in the sense that you're looking at it from a completely new angle that the industry's probably not looking at, and that you probably have a big edge? Now, granted, the bias, the degree of the bias may be off, but it is telling you that maybe, hey, you do have an edge here because it is kind of a sport in its infancy.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, and to be fair, NASCAR is the newest one for me, and I don't have a ton of data yet. Mostly, I've just been encouraged when I see strong players pop up near the top of my sim list. I feel like that's a good sign. It means I can't be too far off from what at least some good players are doing. So,
And that's another question too, right? It's like, you don't want to appeal to authority here, especially in newer sports.
yeah.
A top 10 DFS player, are they actually really good in all of these sports? If you talk to them, they may say yes. The results may say something different. So it can be difficult looking at it that way, but I guess that's the only way to look at it, right? If you don't have any other basis for it, right? I guess that's one signal that you can use.
Yeah, I think it's just, I come at it from a perspective of just constant questioning and interrogation of what my process is actually doing, because I think I'm a little different than most in that I'm sort of a machine learning first approach, in the sense that I try to give my process as much information as it needs to figure out what to do, and then it's sort of on me to try and figure out if it's actually any good or not, and then to try and interrogate, why is it doing this and why is it not doing this, and is that because it's figured out something clever, or are my sims just not good enough yet? These kinds of questions. Because it's really a big data approach. It's a massive number of lineups and tons of simulations and scenarios and stuff. So the hope is that it can figure out things that I and no human could figure out, because it's too complicated, too many interdependencies. But then you're left with the problem of, well, does it really know what it's doing, or is this just, random noise? That's kind of the struggle. That's why I spent so much time writing these after the fact analysis tools, because I'm so paranoid that there's some horrible thing in there that I haven't detected, right? So I have to constantly second guess not only what I'm doing as a software engineer, but like, what is the code actually doing, right?
And I think that's what makes you such an interesting guest, because this show is about the mental side of DFS and the lifestyle side of DFS. And maybe there have been some previous guests that have a similar approach or process, but we haven't talked about it on here because the average DFS player, the average conversation that I've had with them is along the lines of just handling the swings on a surface level. But because of your intellectually curious approach, you're questioning everything. So how do you not drive yourself crazy? So the question I wrote down here was, how do you balance the curiosity and the questioning versus the anxiety of some things you just, there's no way you can actually figure out, or the athlete performance is completely out of your hand? How do you balance that?
That's an excellent question. I spend quite a bit of time thinking about that. And I think it comes down to controlling what you can control, measuring everything you can measure, but then not being so arrogant as to think you've figured everything out, because you haven't and you never will. So that's all good. That's sort of sciencey philosophy of approach, like, trying to figure stuff out. But when it ventures into doubt and anxiety, like, what if I'm wrong? I do spend a lot of time thinking about what I should be paying attention to mentally, what I should not be paying attention to. So I'll just give you one example. For a while, I didn't sweat games at all because I found that I didn't enjoy sweating games. It was just sort of a negative emotional free roll. Like the stress of it was not worth what I got when I actually hit, which probably sounds weird to a lot of people who that's like one of the main reasons they play. But then I got to the point where I was like, okay, I'm not going to watch my scores, but I'm just going to wait until the games are over so I can see how I did. But the thing is, it became sort of an unhealthy mental habit where just in the back of my mind was like, oh, it's like an hour until I can look at my phone and see like what my results were. And I just found that I just became increasingly conscious of the fact that that's just not serving me. Like it's just a constant reminder of the variance, which I already know. Like I don't need to add more of that kind of stress because I already have plenty of variance. I don't need to constantly like tweak that anxiety. So I try to just put the phone down and just do something else in a different room. So yeah, it is definitely a balance, and not driving yourself crazy is really important. I do a fair bit of things to keep myself occupied. I'm about 6 feet away from a treadmill, so if it's 40 minutes to lock and nothing's changed, I'm just waiting around. Just hop on there. That helps my mental health quite a bit. Distracts me from all the mayhem that often ensues. My approach is to just make it as routine as possible and not get too excited in either direction, like either too upset or too happy if I hit. It's easier said than done, though, I'll be honest.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's obviously easier said than done. And a couple points I want to ask you more about. To me, right, and in the other interviews that you've done and just talking to you for these first 15, 20 minutes or so, you seem like a balanced person. Like you can handle all of these things and like you handle them pretty well. But how do you personally feel? Do you think you're well equipped to handle these? Do you think you handle them well? Do you think you're able to balance all these things appropriately, as we just talked about?
I think I'm above average in that regard, but I'm not like Jedi Master level of detachment. I'm pretty good at keeping it cool, although I can be the kind of person where it's sometimes not easy to tell how I'm doing because I'm usually pretty calm externally, but that doesn't always match what's going on with me. I'll say in the gambling world, I actually do pretty well. I think being a poker player myself and having worked with high stakes poker players, I have more of an appreciation of what kind of swings are possible when you're wagering a large amount of money. So that definitely helps. And I also know myself well enough to not be afraid that I'm going to like blow myself up and just go in a downswing and quadruple down and blast all my money off. Like I am pretty good at adjusting my volume based on how things are going and thinking about which contest to enter. based on my bankroll considerations and these sorts of things. So yeah, I think I do okay there. I think it's honestly what bothers me more is just the day to day. You know, if I'm obsessing about what's happening today, like that just has a negative impact on my life. So I'm trying to excise that as much as possible. But yeah, I mean, just globally, I think I told you before the show, running a little below expectation this year, which is not this is not so terrible. I'm still having a winning year. I'm not where the 50th percentile would be. I'm at like, you know, the 20th or the 25th or something, you know. So it's no great tragedy, but just to give listeners some context for how much effort you can put in for not much return. I'll tell you, my baseball season this year, I ran the numbers for both sites. I just play DraftKings and FanDuel for baseball, and I've got about $1.2 million in entries, and I have made $128.05 profit.
I
So
don't mean to laugh at you, but I mean
no,
that's
it is hilarious. I mean, I had to just if you do it's 0.01% return. So what's funny about that, and what can get you down if you're not careful, is I could have just sat on a beach for 3 months of baseball, done nothing, and been basically exactly where I am right now. And I think that kind of counterfactual thinking is also maybe not the healthiest
definitely not.
to indulge. Yeah, but it's, you know, that's just part of the deal. And you know, I've run bankroll sims, and what I'm experiencing now is totally normal. It's not at all out of the realm of the range of outcomes or anything like it. So I really don't have a lot to complain about, but it can one habit of mine that can be really harmful for me in this is just anchoring this idea of like how I've been doing recently is how I should be doing, because, you know, basically I ran some money up, and it's like relatively quickly in the first half of the year, first quarter of the year, and then just came down almost as quickly. And it feels worse in a way because your psychological normal can get adjusted. So I'm trying to be more on guard about that psychologically as well. It's just like, you know, the order of these things is completely arbitrary. So I just have to live with it.
Right. And despite the order being arbitrary, that order has a big impact on how we approach things, how we perceive
Hmm.
things. And just even having that awareness is important. Even if you can't do anything about it, still having that awareness is important. And you mentioned your work in poker, and obviously having a background there can help with understanding the swings and the mental side of things. But it still seems like you have a pretty good grasp on a lot of these topics. Do you attribute that to your personality, or do you think that your line of work or your studies in school and the work that you did there can also contribute to being aware and having a grasp on these things? Or do you think there's any other areas of life that you think have helped contribute to being more balanced about it?
I think a lot of it is personality, to be honest. I mean, I think somebody described me as being. I was on someone else's show, and someone in the comments was saying and I was just talking normally, and he said, you know, is this guy always so stoic all of the time? And I was like, okay. I think a lot of it is temperament, to be sure. I sort of present as more low energy than a lot of people, sort of introverted, quiet, like sit in the basement, hack on my computer. I mean, it's the old joke about programmers are like mushrooms. You throw them in a dark corner and you shovel shit on it, and it prospers. So I'm definitely in that category temperamentally. So it does help with a lot of it. I think the downside there is I could, if I'm not careful, I could spend an entire week where the only people I interact with are my wife, my son, and the checkout person at the grocery store. So I have to be careful not to just like disappear into my little development hole. I think that's honestly something I need to spend more time doing. It's one of the reasons I like talking to people and coming on shows like this, just to get out, so to speak.
It's huge, and pretty much every single guest talks about the importance of having a community of some sort, especially when you're working from home. And like you said, you're in your basement by yourself. You may see three people the entire week. Even talking to people online, even if that interaction is not as quote unquote real as it would be if you talk to someone in real life, but still it helps. Are you in any communities? I know you talked about maybe putting some tools out there and maybe that would help in that regard, but are you talking to other like-minded people or trying to put more effort into talking to more people in the DFS industry outside of just doing these podcasts?
Yeah, I do that. I do chat in some discords, and I've had some conversations on Twitter with various people I respect. So I do that. I have been doing that more, and I think that's definitely been good. And it's fun. I'm interested in doing more of that kind of thing where I have like a garden variety DFS player, and by that I mean someone who's not doing like massive simulations and computing stuff, just like an ordinary, like smart, use an optimizer, like how many good pros win. And someone will ask me a question because they'll think I have the answers because, I'm known. But there's lots of DFS I know very little about. I'm like, huh, that's really interesting. And then I'll do some runs of my own software to try and answer a question. I'm like, let's see what my process does, and maybe we can figure something out. So I have done a fair bit of that, just sort of informally, and I enjoy finding things out that way. I mean, I'm at the point where I'm just now sort of getting a grasp on why my software does as well as it does, and it's interesting to explore those aspects with other people who have more of an intuitive or experienced take on the game of DFS than I do.
And that also helps break up the monotony too, right? If you're just doing the same thing over and over every single day, getting other people's inputs and just testing those can certainly help as well. So I want to go back to your point about not sweating the games.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think most people obviously enjoy, especially if you're a sports fan first and foremost, you enjoy sweating the games and watching the games. But there have been some people that have been on the show and other people that I've talked to that don't enjoy it for the reasons that you mentioned. So I guess the question is, what motivates you or what drives you? What gives you that sense of satisfaction? Is it really just picking up the DraftKings app and seeing, oh yeah, I won 100K tonight, sweet? Or is there some other sort of satisfaction that you draw from this whole thing that we do?
I think it's a combination of things. One is so definitely being able to make a good living playing a game is attractive. I don't know how long I'll do that for, but in the past I've been all about writing tools to help other people win the game of poker. So it's kind of fun to just do something entirely for myself. So definitely the money is one aspect, but I think that the thing that's fun is just seeing how good of a system I can create, like constantly whittling away at that, maybe making this part better or this part faster, or exploring some other avenue. It's really the engineering part, and then the satisfaction from seeing something I built come up with a winning strategy is pretty cool. I'd say it's sort of a competitive thing, but really it's competition against myself. I'm like, can I make a process that's better than I was a year ago or better than I was 6 months ago? Like that's sort of incremental progress is sort of part and parcel of what makes software engineering fun for me. I'd say it's just you keep whittling away and keep making it a little better, and lots of little improvements. After a while, you can get something pretty good at the end.
A quick pause to let you know that this episode is sponsored by the DFS Daily Newsletter, which you can guess by the name is a daily newsletter that recaps the biggest contests in the DFS industry. Get info on optimal lineups, ownership analysis, and dissection of DFS Pro strategies straight to your inbox every morning. They do great work, and I make sure to read it every single day so I'm caught up on the latest strategies of winning players. So if you're looking for ways to improve your DFS game and even learn about related literature to help you think about DFS differently, then sign up for their newsletter at thedfsdaily.com/signup and follow them on Twitter at DFS_newsletter. Now back to the show. Absolutely. So would you say that, let's say you win 200K in the 888 one day, that's not as much satisfaction as you going through your process, finding some improvements, implementing those improvements, and then your back testing shows that those improvements were a plus to your process? Would you say that that latter part is definitely more of a motivator and more impressive to you in that regard?
Yeah, I think that's true. They're not entirely comparable. I'd say, having a big payout is really fun and more like an adrenaline thing. but it's way more satisfying to come up with something new that you can see is better than what you had before. And that happens a fair bit. Ironically, it makes sense. The worse the sport is from my process perspective, the more often that's going to happen, right? So I've got more room to improve.
Yep.
So I definitely enjoy. And the thing is, the DFS landscape is so large and varied. I'm never lacking for something interesting to try. Like, I've got a million different things. There's lots of things I think I've pretty well solved, and there's a bunch of things I know I haven't solved yet. And there's a bunch of things I haven't solved I don't even know about yet. I haven't even discovered. So it's just, I think, having that runway where I can improve things. It's entirely up to me how far down I want to go, the rabbit hole, so to speak.
Right, because for those areas you mentioned, there are different levels, right? There could be a sport level. There could be a specific subset of that sport. There could be a different contest size or type. There could be the lineup construction aspect. There could be the player projection aspect. There could be the optimization, right? Like, so all these areas, not only do you have a bunch of different sports to try, but you have a bunch of different areas within each sport to research and try out. So from that standpoint, there's as many things you want to look at.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fun to hop into a new sport and see reasonably good results pretty quickly. Like, that hasn't happened every time, but it's happened where, like, I could immediately tell I was already competitive. I'm like, what's the simplest thing I can try with what I have already? Oh, and then it's actually not bad already. So, but yeah, just always have something I can work on. How much time I spend working on it is another question. I'm pretty ad hoc with what I approach and when. I just have like a giant list of things on a file that I could do. I'm not super structured about when and how I do those things.
You see something, let's add it to the list. Let's see something, add it to the list. And then one day you're like, are you just reviewing that list constantly, or is it something else? Oh, that reminds me, that's on my list. Maybe I should start looking into that.
Yeah, it's not really structured, to be honest. I refer back to it, but not constantly. But sometimes I get burned down on development. Like, the last few weeks have been mostly just executing, running my software, entering contests, less new development. But sometimes I'll just spend an entire week going full on at a new problem. I did a ton of new development for NFL, which did not really pay off that well. And then I did some more analysis tools, but it's been a few weeks since I've done anything really new, so I probably should get back to it.
Fair enough. And just really quickly, just top of mind, whatever you're willing to answer, what would you say? Well, I wouldn't even say what would you say, because I don't even know if it's an opinion. You probably have the numbers to back it up. Biggest edge sport for you personally, the lowest edge that you have in a sport. And then how would you answer that question for someone who's looking to get into a new sport? Which sport would you think would offer the biggest edge for a newer player, and what would be the hardest sport?
So my biggest edge that I've measured, and it's a small sample size because it's NFL Showdown, and I don't think it's because my sims are particularly good. It's just that there's so much dead money in those contests. That's what dominates the equation, because football is just so much larger than everything else that the percentage of massively negative EV lineups is quite high. So I would say that's probably the highest. It's the highest I've measured, but NFL Showdown, like, my entire NFL Showdown set is smaller than like half an MLB season.
Right.
So it's a small, right? So maybe it's not that good. I know there's something about the set of Showdowns I've already played that just favors my approach. That could totally be the case. I think the least edge well, not counting NASCAR, where I don't think I have an edge yet, or I'm not sure that I do. I think the lowest edge for me is probably basketball, and I think it's because mostly I focus on contests where late swap is not an issue, so either NBA Showdown or short slates, because, as you know, NBA is a gigantic pain, and you simply have to be monitoring everything all night long until the last game locks, and I'm generally not willing to do that. I find that my edge there, if I have one, it's so small, it's just within the standard error. At least on DraftKings, it's very close to zero. And I suspect, for a new player, I would suspect that NFL probably offers the biggest edge. But I would also say basketball with late swap probably does. If you're playing a small number of lineups and you're following all the games live and you're reasonably smart about DFS, I expect you can do pretty well in basketball, because The problem I have is, I do have procedures for NBA late swap, but they're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of lineups. Whereas if you're a relatively new player and you're juggling a dozen, that's pretty manageable. But I don't have any data to back that up.
And I have another question that you may not have the data to back up, but do you think there are pros out there that have an optimized process that is long-term plus EV in late swap? Obviously, we know that's a big key to NBA DFS, but do you think that problem is fully solvable? And if so, do you think anyone is close to it as far as current players?
Honestly, I'd just be speculating. I've thought about what I would do there, and I think there's some interesting avenues for research. But I think it's a generally complicated problem. I can imagine doing things like analyzing all of the contest entries mid-flight, basically, and recomputing things and swapping things that way. But it's hard. You need a lot of information. You need to know what's the fantasy production been of all of the players thus far, and you need something like a projection for whatever their remaining minutes are, which is not necessarily so simple, right? I mean, imagine you've got a player projected for, 32 minutes. How many minutes does he really have left? Might not be so easy to automatically estimate and or download, if you see what I'm getting at. So I think it's a problem, but it's definitely interesting. Not something I'm planning to attack. I think I'm personally better served by just exploring different sports and refining what I have, making my process better.
Totally understand. And if not only for the reason that most people talk about with NBA DFS is the time you have to spend at your computer on weeknights, especially when you have a family, which we'll get into here in a bit. And before we get into that, I did want to talk about this running under expectations, your downswing that you're talking about. What is, and again, as much or as little detail as you're willing to describe, Daniel, what is the worst downswing you've had? And that could be from an actual dollar amount perspective, a length perspective, or even just a mental perspective.
So I generally it's funny that I do it this way. I don't really look at my entire bankroll as a whole. When I think about how I'm doing, I sort of look at each sport on each site separately. So I track everything on a separate spreadsheet. So I've got like a DraftKings NFL spreadsheet and a FanDuel MLB spreadsheet. I think the worst one I had was NFL last year. So the 2021 part of the NFL season. I think I was down. It was low six figures, 150 or two maybe. But that's just that sport. There were some other things that picked up the slack in other sports. So I've been extremely lucky in terms of the depth of my downswings in absolute dollars. I mean, that's what I keep reminding myself. Don't feel bad for yourself. I've seen what other competent players, like serious downswings, look like when people are occasionally posting them. It's like, I haven't hit that 5%, 10% outcome yet, which would suck, but I expect it to happen at some point. So it's just part of the deal.
It is. And you're fortunate, like you said, not to have hit that, but it's within the range of outcomes for sure. So when you were down 150, 200K, whatever it was, in NFL, did it change your bankroll management decisions at all? I know you said earlier that there's an ebb and flow in the contest you enter and where your bankroll stands, but what does the decision-making process from an allocation and contest selection standpoint look like for you when you're on a bit of a downswing like that?
So there's two aspects. The first thing I'm always looking at is like, what's my estimated edge using my methodology? How much data do I have? That's always number one. Am I really convinced I have an edge here? And then the second thing is, okay, if I'm not doing so well, the first contests I cut are going to be the high dollar, high volatility, always. So the ones that are diabolical from a bankroll management perspective are these mid 3-digit entry contests, like the 555s, where there's hundreds of entries and like a third of the prize pool is for first.
Yes.
Those are just monstrously volatile. Like, that's the first thing I'm going to cut out if I'm not doing well in a given sport. And it's actually, part of it is just psychological. Like, for MLB at this point, like, I'm basically back where I started at the beginning of the season. I mean, I've effectively transferred money from DraftKings to FanDuel because I lost X on DraftKings and I won almost exactly the same amount on FanDuel. But just psychologically, too, I think those contests just feel the worst because you can have 10, 15 entries for like 10 grand and get $1,000 back. And it's not that unusual.
Right.
And it's just, I'd like to believe that I can just shrug all that off and be a robot about it, but I accept that I'm not perfect that way. So I'll give myself a break by cutting out those kinds of contests, even if my bankroll and my estimate of profitability says I should go ahead and play those. I'll not play them for a week. That's perfectly fine. You don't have to play everything, right?
Easier said than done sometimes, for sure. But that leads into my next question. So those mid three-figure contests that you're referencing, first half of the question is, I assume because you do play them that your sims in your process tell you that they are profitable for you despite how much of the prize goes to first. And do you think that, and I'm sure you have the answer, or maybe you don't, but you would know how to find the answer, that you could enter less lineups and have less volatility slate to slate and still have a good enough ROI and hit the first prize often enough to offset the lesser amount of lineups that you're playing? And then as an extension of that question later on, because we see more and more prizes or more and more prize pools where first gets a bigger portion, how do you see the future of DFS, the entire ecosystem, as far as the prizes, the contests, the sharpness of players that are entering them?
So I think I should talk about the second thing first. So it's a little bit complicated in my view. I think so. I don't have any insight into how the sites themselves work or operate. We're all just guessing. I know one person who works at one of them. That's it, and doesn't really tell me anything. But you could see how offering a big top prize is important to them to attract players, right? And I don't know what formula they use. And it's also true that generally speaking, and this is true in poker as well, higher volatility is good for good players for a number of reasons. I think one is it's harder to reason about. It's harder to figure out a game that pays 10,000 times you're buying for first than one that 10 times you're buying for first. Like, how far off the beaten path can I go in my lineup? Like, these kinds of things are actually quite difficult to pin down. But the other thing is high volatility contests give, let's say, more casual players a shot at winning a lot of money, right? Whereas if you have a low volatility contest like head-to-heads, like casual players just going to get their ass handed to them relatively quickly, right? So at least there's a chance. So I think on the one hand, it's better for everyone in terms of entertainment value for casual players, probably win rate for good players to have big prizes up front, up top, but it sure makes bankroll management more difficult when you have that situation. I mean, NFL is the most egregious. Some of these contests, if you sim it out, if you just make wildly generous estimates of your ability, like say you're 5 times better than the field or something crazy, like your chance of ever hitting first in these gigantic things in your lifetime playing DFS is still quite small. So I don't have a scientific answer, but I think for me, my approach lately has been to spread out my volume in as wide a variety of contest structures as possible. So I enter the biggest GPPs, I enter small ones. I've been playing the 25-man, $2,000 single entry. I've been just spreading it all out with the hopes that at least there'll be some non-correlated performance between those contests, right? Like if you're an investor and you're investing, you don't want your assets to be correlated because generally speaking, you're just getting variance for no reward, right? You just want to get rid of the risk part that you're not getting paid for. So I've spent a lot of time making my process faster so that I can enter like 25 different contests across multiple sites relatively quickly. So that's been pretty good because in the sense that I will see on like a given slate, maybe I enter 10 contests of various sizes, have very different results in all of them. And that's kind of what I want.
Right.
Yeah. One of the things that I noticed with some other competitive players, I don't know whether to say pros or not, because I don't know if they are, but I'll just say competitive players versus casual players. But some competitive players will run like the same flavor of lineup across every contest they enter. And that is just a recipe for massive variance. And it kind of drives me crazy too when they win one personally, because it's like, well, if that guy wins, I'm not winning anything because he won all 11 contests, right?
Yes.
So that's sort of my approach. I just treat each contest separately and hope it all balances out. But it can be maddening too. Like I'll run my sims. One of the reasons I only break even, I mean, it's hardly something to complain about in MLB is in my simulations, I look at, in addition to the average ROI, I look at what's the 95th percentile for each contest. Because those outlier events are going to dominate your fantasy performance in any year.
Right.
And most of my outlier performances have been in not the bigger ones.
Of course, right?
So it's like, why couldn't I have the 95th percentile and, the 100K to first
Right.
and not the 5K to first? So, I mean, there's just a lot of random crap like that you just have to deal with.
I mean, a lot of things you said there are super sharp. And honestly, from a selfish perspective, I don't even want to dive that deeper into them because I think you make so many good points, especially about the risk management side of entering so many different contests on a slate. Because you're playing different players, different lineup types, and different contests, and because of our conversations on Twitter, I know that you sim different contests. You're naturally going to have different risk reward in each contest. So while a slate may go one way, you're not necessarily dead in all of your contests because of the way you're playing.
Right. I mean, you can still be kind of dead, but it's not as often. The main way you get really dead is if something really popular just goes nuts.
Sure.
Then it doesn't matter how many contests I enter. I'm just not going to make much money then. But yeah, it does. It definitely does seem to smooth things out. I mean, the performance is still going to be correlated against contests in a slate just because I'm still using my sims and my methodology. But yeah, my process plays these different contests pretty differently, so it does help.
All right, let's move on to your family life. I know we're running a little long here, so let's talk about family life, lifestyle, daily routines, things like that. You mentioned earlier you have the treadmill, so obviously use that to balance and help shape your mental a little bit while you're dealing with the day to day. But also, you mentioned on other shows that you're a singer, which is just crazy to me to think that someone's brain can do all of the programming and can be an excellent singer as well. Very accomplished singer you are. So, how does singing fit into your life, and does that provide an outlet or a balance at all to all the DFS that you play?
So singing, I think singing is part of music in general is important part of my identity in a way that fantasy probably isn't. I'd say I'm more of an engineer identity wise than a fantasy player, although maybe that's starting to change. But singing is really important to me. I studied it in school and I've been performing for a long time. So I sort of pick and choose which gigs I want to do in any given year. I might perform 6 or 8 or 10 different gigs in a year. But I really think of them as two separate things. I don't think of them as playing off each other like my fantasy work or my music work. They're just really two different things like to do that are just very different from each other. But family-wise, I mean, one of the best things for me about working from home and doing fantasy stuff is I can set pretty much whatever schedule I want. And it's very valuable to me that I get as much of my family as I do all the time. So the way I approach my actual, what am I going to play? I've heard other people say that they might prioritize a fantasy contest over some other part of their life. I actually don't. I generally take the opposite approach. So I sort of play fantasy opportunistic. It's like whichever contests fit on my schedule, I play those. But if I have any sort of social outing, or my son is in a concert, or we want to go to a restaurant, or whatever, like that's always taking top priority for me. And part of that is just a choice and a luxury, but also, frankly, I could just enter all of the contests all of the time. So it's sort of welcome to have those required interruptions where it's like, no, I'm not going to freaking play MLB when I could go to like someone's cookout instead.
I don't blame you, right? Especially,
Yeah.
NBA, MLB, those daily sports. Do you still find time to play the weekly sports though, like NFL or PGA, even if you have something going on because it is a weekly contest?
Yeah, PGA is pretty easy just because I just have to get up early enough to check everything.
God, yeah.
Yeah, but I usually wake up pretty early as it. PGA is no problem for me. It's really like which MLB, right now it's like which MLB slates I play and which am I going to take off because I get a little obsessive about that. So it's good to break that up with more human level behavior.
Absolutely. Real quick, going back to the singing, it's interesting to me because you described yourself as an introvert, and I would imagine most introverts aren't that comfortable on stage. How do you think that works for you? Is it just the confidence in your ability? Is it just your love for it? How does being an introverted or having an introverted personality translate into being a great performer?
That's a really astute question because I think most vocal performers are extroverts. Most of them are like they want to be the center of attention. They
Right.
want to perform and interact with people. They want to connect with the audience. My strategy is you deny the existence of the audience entirely. Just pretend like they don't exist.
So are you just performing for
You know, it's
yourself
like
then? Like your enjoyment of the music? Is that why you perform?
well, hopefully it's not just for my own enjoyment, although it's a big part of it. I mean, I do want to deliver the music to people, but it's always about the music. The music is always first for me, not so much how I present. I don't know if I'm articulating this very well, but it's definitely a weakness of mine. I definitely have to work at all of the stagecraft thing and connecting with the audience. Like that's not in my wheelhouse at all. So I am cognizant of the fact that those things do matter quite a bit, and I can't just get up there and do my thing without any acknowledgement of what's happening around me. So but yeah, it's always driven by the love of the music itself and the joy of performing with the extremely accomplished colleagues I have the privilege of performing with. So
And a quick Google search of Daniel's name will show you how accomplished his colleagues that are. So if you're interested in that, go check that out. So another question that I ask every guest is when you meet new people out in the world, when they ask you, oh, Daniel, what do you do for a living? Does music ever come first? Like depending on the audience that you're with, what is your process for answering that question?
it's a funny one. So it depends on the context. If it's a complete stranger in a just random situation, I'll probably go with singer and software engineer. That's what I'll open with. But if I'm like playing poker at a card room, I'll say I play, fantasy sports because I'm in a venue where people understand that.
Sure.
I think a lot of people in my life, like community members, I was I was on my son's elementary school PTA board, so I have a lot of connections to moms around, and a few of them know what I'm up to. I've talked to some of them, but it is a funny conversation. Very few of them know the amounts of money that are involved. Like, there's only a couple people I would trust with that, and I think you've talked about this with others before. It could be pretty weird for most people to broach that. But there's a few close friends I have who are not in the world who have a rough understanding of what I'm up to in the fantasy space. But I enjoy talking about it. I mean, I'm not afraid to talk about it, but I kind of try to feel out whether it's it's kind of information the person can receive or not. Because there's some people I don't think would have any inkling that this could even be a thing, or
Right.
just might think I'm full of it or something.
Right, because on shows like this, right, you can go deep and say, yeah, I run simulations and I have all in machine learning and all these different complex areas where the average person in the public isn't going to care about that. So if they ask one further question, oh, you do software engineering or you play fantasy sports, what's that next level of base knowledge that you give them?
Yeah, I think what I end up coming back to, if they are not familiar with it, is that because I think most civilians, as it were, when they hear you talk about this, they think of sports betting first,
Yes.
right? And so say sports betting is against the house, but the game I'm playing is against other players. So I always come back to the analogy with poker, and that usually clicks for people. They're like, "Oh, okay." I'm like, I don't think I could beat the house for much money at all sports betting because before they start banning you anyway. Other conversation, but they understand. Oh, okay, playing other people these contests for money.
That's a great way to explain. I've never thought about that analogy, but I imagine that would definitely click for the average person more. And calling them civilians, I think I'm gonna start using that as well.
Well, I mean, it's hard because if you just open with like, I'm wagering all this money, like somebody who doesn't understand the space, like the first place they're gonna go is like, this is a degenerate gambler who is like trying to justify his behavior as a profession, right? That's probably where I would start to think if I didn't know any better. So no, I'm actually in contest with other people, trying to outsmart other people at this game. Then people usually get that.
All right, that's a great way to approach it. So we've talked about a lot of interesting topics here, Daniel. So I'll let you get out of here. We're hitting over an hour here. So the final two questions I ask every guest is, first and foremost, what do you think is the most important skill to have in being a DFS pro or a competitive DFS player?
I think it's to, well, it's two-part. Is that cheating? I think it's to analyze your results as accurately as possible, so you know whether you actually have an edge that you can exploit in the game. So this is hard to do, but I think constantly be trying to assess if you really have an edge. That's the sort of mechanistic one. And then, the human one is just having fortitude is the right word. Having the emotional bankroll to to actually, stick around when things get tough. You need to try to role play in your head, what happens if I play for 6 months and I'm down money? Like, what's that going to feel like for me? I think there's a lot of people who have all the technical ability to win, but who would just be miserable. And their time would be better suited doing something else. Even though they could be good enough to win, they're just going to be a wreck, and it wouldn't be worth it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a huge part of this, but a big reason why I started the show, obviously. So yeah, I think that's a big skill to have, and yeah, no technical skill can help you overcome any deficiency in that area. So, and the final question is, it's 2022. Someone out there DMs you and says, "Hey, I'm thinking about becoming a DFS pro, or I have a day job and I would love to be a DFS pro." What would you tell them? What advice would you give them? Would you tell them to pursue it if they really wanted to? What would you say to them?
I think for most people, it's going to come down to the individual person, of course, but I think for most people, there's probably better things you can do. And I think the reason is, if you're good enough to do this well, you're probably good enough to do a lot of other things well too. And there's an opportunity cost in not advancing your career in something else. So I know that sounds weird coming from me, but I think to do this and for it to make sense, you have to be good at it. You have to have the temperament for it. And then I think you need a life circumstance where it's not costing you too much, or it's benefiting you enough that, not doing something else isn't such a loss to you. I think, like, for me, I ended up here because I was already working in the gambling space. Like, I already in a good position to do it. So I think for most people, it's probably like so many things, like, why not just wade into it? If you want to get serious, you can always dial it up or dial it down. You don't have to drop everything in your life to see if this can work for you. I'd recommend maybe an incremental approach for someone really seriously going up.
I actually have a follow-up question. I know I said that was the final question, but I do have another question, because I don't think I've talked about this since the first episode with Colin. And this is something I think about from time to time, because I did quit my day job three years ago to pursue this full time. And part of the conversation you have with your significant other, your family, your friends during this is, all right, what happens if it fails? Or you just change your mind and you want to get back into the workforce. And in the most corporate setting, and Daniel, I don't know if that's something that interests you, but if you decided to get back into the corporate world after doing this for a few years, how do you think that conversation would go? How do you think you would be able to display your skills and what you've accomplished in this space to a prospective employer?
Yeah, I think I would imagine if, like, an hour-long PowerPoint presentation, trying to describe the research process and the results and all of those details. This is kind of what I was trying to reference earlier, is that this is something I can do because I know the worst case scenario is I flame out of DFS. I can always find some kind of software job. It may suck. I may not like it, but I'll get one.
Right.
So we'll be fine. So it's a very luxurious place to be in. I think having skills you can show an employer, or just showing them that you're serious and went deep into something. I know in the tech world, I used to work in Silicon Valley. Like, if you go deep into something, like, people will respond to that and can tell that you're serious and can, like, figure things out. Like, that goes a long way, tech world at least. So that's what I keep telling myself anyway.
Yeah, and I have the maybe naive perspective of, if it's an employer that doesn't necessarily understand that you just discussed, then it's probably not a place that you want to work anyways. And
Right.
but again,
Yeah.
you never know what jobs you may be forced to take depending on your situation. So all a very good conversation. So Daniel, I'll give you the floor now. If there's anything you want to promote, anything we haven't talked about that you would like to discuss, now's the time.
I think I'm good for now. Don't have any concerts to announce for a while, so I would have given that out. But
Cool. So, Daniel, I appreciate your time talking with me. I've been trying to get you on the show here for a while, so I'm glad we were able to get this done. And everyone out there, appreciate you listening as always.